Well, hello once again, and thanks for retuning once more to your number one classic dirt bike TV channel, and I do hope you're continuing to enjoy my video content with regards looking at these old vintage racers, and of course, like myself, discovering some of the history behind them. Now, we do have some fantastic bikes lined up in the coming weeks and months, and we have one or two projects that we still have to go out and film for my channel, but we will be taking a look at many more of these kind of machines in the future here on Classic Dirt Bike TV. So if you've not already done it, I do hope you will consider subscribing to my channel, because that way, of course, each and every time I upload a brand new video, you will be notified immediately. So to continue the old classic dirt bike theme, we're going to take a look at a bike now that basically changed the way of motocross when it first was introduced in the early 1970s. So this time round, we're going to take a look at Andy Farr's lovely CR250M Honda Elsinore. Now, to think that back in the day, the main man at Honda, who was at that time Soichiro Honda, made that iconic statement in the late 1960s that Honda will never ever build a two-stroke motorcycle. And then, just a few years later, they built and released this iconic machine, the mighty CR250 Elsinore. Now, this bike alone really changed the face of motocross forever, and it was Honda's first ever purpose-built dirt bike, where others, of course, before it were just basically modified road bikes. Now, these Elsies sold in huge numbers across the globe and introduced a brand new generation into motocross racing, and it's almost impossible to overstate the impact that this bike alone made on the global off-road stage. Now, these Honda Elsinores, of course, got their name from the Lake Elsinore off-road race, which was a huge event in California in the early 1970s. And although our example here is a 250 model, it was actually its baby brother, the 125, that sold in bigger numbers. But our featured bike here belongs to Andy Farr, although I'm led to believe that the previous owner of this bike was a certain Chris Lewis, who was one of the UK's top riders on these 250s. Now, the bike's not an original from that 1970s period, as it has a few upgrades fitted to improve its handling and rider preferences, but nonetheless it's still a very nice example of one of these legendary motorcycles. Now, as if this bike wasn't popular enough in the early 1970s, Hollywood legend Steve McQueen was also seen riding one of these bikes on TV, and of course that also boosted the sales of these Elsinore bikes, and bike dealers across the globe were selling them faster than they could keep up with the demand. And for a bike that did so much to get generations of motorcyclists into off-road racing, it's very surprising in this modern day how few of these bikes that you actually see at Scrambles events. Now, as you're no doubt aware, the motor on these 250 Elsinores was a single-cylinder piston port two-stroke that in standard trim had, I think it was a bore of about 70mm and a stroke of around 64mm. Now, the engine also had your standard wet multi-plate clutch, and as I remember, these I think had a 5-speed gearbox. Now, I'm sure that Honda used magnesium engine casings on these little Elsinores just to try and keep the overall weight of the bike down, although this was already a very light machine. I think it only weighed in at just over the £200 mark, but as a 1970s two-stroke, these LC motors were little buzz bombs that were very quick, reliable, and of course they would rev to the moon and back if you wanted them to. And for a bike manufacturer's first time attempt to build a 250 two-stroke motocrosser, it appeared that Honda nailed it first time out. Now, I'm not entirely sure if Andy's motor here has been kept in its standard trim, as there is quite a lot that you can do with these 250 engines with regards tuning and upgrades, although going by what I saw on the racetrack on the day I took these clips, this is still a seriously quick little motorcycle. Now, at the bike's front end, these billet alloy top and bottom fork yokes are of course not the originals, and these are actually manufactured by Phil Denton Engineering here in the UK, and PDE do make all manner of parts for these types of vintage Honda racers. Now, the bike's front forks are unfortunately not known to me personally, and I'm not sure if these are actually the originals or a set of replacements, although I'd wager that these are again upgrades to the original 1970s items. Now, again, as you'd expect, drum brakes, of course, as this was still the early 1970s, but these old school drum brakes were still quite capable of slowing down this 250 if you wanted to make an emergency stop or maybe a quick turn. Now, at the bike's back end, the original shocks have been swapped for a pair of these top quality Maxton units, which are made in Frodsham in Cheshire here in the UK. Now, these are top quality items, and Maxton make all manner of suspension units, not only for off-road bikes but for road going and road racing machines as well. And these Maxton suspensions are a popular choice for use on these types of older vintage racers. Now, originally on these 1974 or 75 Elsinores, I think the swing arm would have been made from steel tubing, but as you can see here, again, this has been changed for this lovely alloy swing arm that once more is another very high quality product from Phil Denton Engineering in Llanrwst in North Wales. Now, these superbly engineered swing arms are just one of the many parts that PDE can supply for your older twin-shock Hondas, and these parts are usually lighter and often stronger than the original Honda steel items. And once more, these LCs had an alloy fuel tank, which, as I remember, I think they held about 1.5 gallons of fuel, which was usually more than enough to feed that 250 motor with its gas for a full race moto. Now, if my aging memory serves me correctly, the 1974 bikes did have a green stripe on the top of the tank, and I think the later 75 version had this red stripe painted on it, so the chances are that this bike of Andy's is possibly a 75 example, although of course it could be a 1974 bike with a 75 tank on it, but either way it's still a little cracker of a machine. Now, in the vintage Elsinore spare parts world, these fuel tanks are quite rare items to get a hold of, and if you've got a spare Elsinore fuel tank hanging around your garage or workshop that's in quite decent condition and free of dents or damage, then these can be worth a good chunk of money if you can find somebody who's rebuilding or restoring one of these Honda Elsinores. Now, once more, as you can see, not too a bad seat on these 250s for a mid-1970s racer, although you certainly did need as much padding as you could possibly get due to the limited amount of suspension travel on these bikes that they had at the rear. But the Elsinore seat certainly wasn't the worst in its class, and there were a few other 1970s bikes that had worse seats, and some were even just like sitting on a solid board. Now again, all of the controls on Andy's bike are all replacements from what would have been fitted at the Honda factory in the 1970s, and a very good set of Riken levers have been fitted here with their associated adjusters, and also a new set of Venhill cables have been added to the controls as well. Now naturally, new Renthal bars have also been added, which have been bolted onto these alloy bar risers. Now this of course would have been done just to suit Andy's own personal riding position and his stature when he sat on the bike. Now very few of these Elsinores still have their original exhaust systems fitted these days, and in that respect Andy's bike is certainly no different, as it's also been fitted with this top of the range PFR race pipe, or Pro Form Racing if you want to give it its full title. But these again are very good quality, and of course a straight bolt-on replacement for the Honda original. Now of course this little plastic mudguard extension was an Elsinore trademark back in the day, but this part was more of an advertising gimmick really, rather than it having any practical use on a racetrack. Now the bike's wheels again, as you'd expect, are not originals but are modern style XL Tagasago gold anodized rims, and these have been completely rebuilt with brand new spokes onto the Honda drums, and a pair of Michelin Starcross tyres looks like they've been added just to finish the bike off. But these Elsinores did have a very slim profile for a 250 bike, and although Andy's example here may not be to everybody's interpretation of what an older Honda Elsinore should look like, I'm pretty sure that most, if not all, of this bike's modifications were actually done by the previous owner before Andy acquired the bike. Although, as I said, you would be quite hard pressed to actually find an original 125 or 250 Elsinore these days. Now there may be one or two going about, but they'll more than likely be tucked away in private collections or motorcycle museums somewhere because of their rarity and iconic status. But it's still great to see these bikes still taking part in vintage or classic race events in these modern times, even although bikes such as Andy's here are not the factory originals. But this particular race event at Whitekirk near Edinburgh was actually the first time Andy had put the bike on a racetrack since he bought it, and watching him in action on the track on the day just took me back to the early 1970s when these Honda Elsinores were kings of the racetrack. Although whether this bike's original or not, it doesn't really matter to me really. I think it's more important that we still get to see these iconic bikes in the flesh, so to speak, because there will come a day when all we'll have will be memories and pictures of one of the most influential off-road race bikes of our time. Well, there you have it. Not a fully original Elsinore from the early 1970s, but nevertheless a quite nice example of one of those iconic race bikes from back in the day. That's Andy Farr's CR250M Elsinore. Now, as I said, we do have some fantastic bikes coming up in the very near future, so if these old school vintage classics are the kind of bikes that you like to look at here on YouTube, then please consider subscribing to my channel, and that way you won't miss out on any of my future video postings. Right, so coming up next on my channel will be taking a look at this quite nice looking 440 Micro twin shocker. Now this is a bike that belongs to Scotsman Kevin Smith, and it's not a fully original Micro twin shocker, of course, but we will be taking a look at this quite nice bike of Kevin's in my next video here on your channel. So once again, thanks very much for taking the time to take a look at my video content, and we'll all speak again very soon when we return to your favourite classic dirt bike TV channel.